This conversation is with Markus Somm, a well-known Swiss journalist and historian, a classical liberal, and now also an entrepreneur. In our conversation, we discussed the Nebelspalter, or in English, the Fog Splitter, a Swiss online news portal that Markus launched in 2020. It reports on topics from an independent, conservative, and free market standpoint. That is very important and valuable. It affords a rare voice that provides viewpoints and arguments that are different from the overwhelmingly one-sided consensus narratives that we are generally exposed to every day. Markus and his team are not afraid to speak up in an independent and contrarian voice on controversial topics like energy, climate, gender ideology, or Switzerland's difficult relationship with the European Union. Markus is a first-class historian and has written several excellent books, many of which I have read and enjoyed. Therefore, certainly we touch on Switzerland's unique history and on why Switzerland has become so successful and to this day stands out as a beacon of freedom and prosperity in a world of debt and increasing centralism. I agree with Markus that we need to speak up more and talk more and share more the unique Swiss system of Swiss direct democracy, share its benefit in hope that maybe others will listen and adopt some of the ingredients of the Swiss success story. As always, I hope you enjoy this conversation. I hope you find it of interest and let us know what you think and let others know about these fireside conversations if you like them. Markus, welcome to Edmonton. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be talking a lot about Switzerland and the history of Switzerland. You're a historian and a publisher. But before we do that, let's talk a bit about you. Maybe you can give us a bit of your background and your history, how you became a journalist and a publisher.
It's a good question. Why did I become a journalist? I always liked to write.
Yeah.
I was good at writing also in school. But actually, originally, I wanted to become a farmer, like many boys, I think. And it's hard to say. Actually, then I studied first law. Then I thought that's a little bit boring. So I switched to history. And then I wanted to become a professor, which was not very original, but
You were all over the place.
I just thought, okay, when I'm at the university, it was so nice, so let's
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 stay.
stay there. Let's stay there. No, and then by chance, actually, I got the opportunity to a traineeship at a local newspaper in Baden, a very small newspaper, and then I just realized, hey, writing about politics, that's something which is really interesting for me.
Mm.
And so I started to become a journalist.
One of the things I was really surprised about when I was at your office recently was that picture. And maybe question, can we publish? Can we use that picture in the video?
Sure.
So
I'm
that
proud
picture
of
says,
it.
so that picture, that poster in your office says, Wähle sozialistisch.
It's a very interesting historical document. It was actually about the election in 1919, and that was the first time when Switzerland voted for parliament in a different system, which meant that the Social Democrats grew very strong. And that was you can say that was an important turning point in the political history of Switzerland. So that's the reason why I still think this poster is really worth looking at. And it's also a nice poster in a way, because you can realize that at that time, the socialists, they really had...
They had a real mission back then,
Absolutely,
too.
and they
I
thought
agree.
the future belongs to us. And it's a nice poster in a way.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I wouldn't say they are really the future, of course.
So you turned from, you were once upon a time, you were a socialist, and now you've turned more conservative, free market,
Absolutely.
libertarian. Where would you position yourself?
Liberal in the classical European sense, I would say. Liberal in the US means left wing, that's not the same.
It's not
But
the
in
same.
Europe, liberal is actually the right term for my political affiliation. And I mean, I come from a family which was for centuries a little bit exaggerated, but they were always liberals. Free Democrats, that's the Free Democratic Party of Switzerland, used to be the most powerful party in the country. established actually also the modern federal state, so it's a very important party. And when you grow up with a father who was officer, and and he was also CEO of a big company, and he was of course a free Democrat,
You had to rebel a
you
little
just
bit.
turn left a little bit because you wanna rebel against your father and against the tradition of your family. I think that was in my case, and also, I mean, it's just a fact. If you study history, you turn left because the history departments in Switzerland, in Germany, nowadays, even in the US, they are just left wing.
So how were you able to make the U-turn?
I think there are two interesting or important turning points. First of all, when I was with the Tagesanzeiger. The Tagesanzeiger is the biggest liberal, in the American sense, left-wing newspaper
Daily
in
newspaper.
Switzerland.
Yeah.
Very influential and so on. That's actually the newspaper I started with my job. And in Bern, I was a part of the team covering federal politics. So when I got to the parliament, I just realized at that time I was still a fan of the European Union. And then I realized something very important, which has to do a lot with the success of Switzerland. I realized that we have a special system. We have a direct democracy, which means that from time to time there's a referendum on many, many very important issues in this country. And the interesting thing is actually that usually you don't realize how important that is also in the parliament, because actually in the parliament, every politician, it doesn't matter if he's left wing or he's a conservative, every politician knows whenever we pass a law, we have to make sure that a majority is safe. The majority is safe. That means even if there will be a referendum, and you can never say if there is a referendum, even if there is a referendum, we have to win. We have to win over a majority of the people in case. That means we have to pass a law which is pragmatic, which is reasonable, which is consensual. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have still very, very smart laws. Our laws are much more pragmatic than in other countries where the parliament can pass a law without any referenda. And then when I realized this, I just realized, hey, we can never join the European Union. It's impossible because this very special system of Switzerland is incompatible with the European system.
So you basically recognized the uniqueness of the Swiss system,
Yeah, that
of
was
its direct democracy.
exactly. That was very important actually as an experience, and I experienced it just at the spot where laws are passed, and that was quite a surprise. And I think many people in the country don't know that. We have to tell people that the politicians, they are really afraid of them. They really know, hey, it's not so easy to pass a law if everybody has the right to vote on it.
Yeah, initiatives and then referendums.
Absolutely. And then I went to the US for another stay at the university in Harvard. And there I did a Master of Public Administration.
Okay.
And at that time, Harvard was still very much dominated actually by Clinton Democrats. And I think those were reasonable people. They were, they didn't believe in socialism at the first time. At that time. I mean, the Democrats nowadays are different. It has changed a lot. But at that time, you had reasonable Democrats. They were brilliant. They were funny. They were smart. And at the same time, they had a good opinion of capitalism. And I think the US was really important because at that time, the US was still more liberal in the European sense than Europe. I just realized, hey, it might be possible that somebody who is smart can also be a right-winger. Because at that time, we were so arrogant. At that time at the university, we were so arrogant. We thought, hey, there was a saying, the spirit or intelligence is always on the left side.
I think they still believe that.
They still believe that, which is not true. So I think it has to do with my career as a journalist that, if you really cover politics, you just realize, hey, many, many ideas of the left just don't work out.
If I look at journalists today, most of them they're having a hard time. I wish more of them would follow follow your lead, because at this point there's I think the majority of the media is left-leaning, and the story that we get from most mainstream media is very, it's one story, it's a single story, and that's, I mean, that's when misconceptions and ideologies suddenly become reality. So and that kind of brings us to your project of Nebelspalter. I mean, that's really the baby that you've been growing now for the past 2 years. For our English-speaking audience, we have to explain that Nebelspalter means the fog splitter. So basically,
Exactly. Yeah.
you know, to
Exactly.
provide some clarity, and
Yeah.
that as a mission, I think, is awesome.
Yeah, that was
So
also the reason why I fell in
I think
love.
that's what you liked.
Absolutely. It's just a fantastic brand. And I also have to say, you know, as a historian, the Nebelspalter has actually a cartoon on every topic that was important in Swiss history in the last 150
So a
years.
huge archive.
It used to be actually a satirical magazine. It was founded in 1875.
Okay.
And at that point, it's now the oldest still existing satirical magazine in the world. So that's quite something. That was also the reason why I bought it.
Right.
On the other hand, I have to admit it's also difficult, because actually we want to turn this Nebelspalter to something else.
Yep.
I mean, still we are a satirical magazine as far as the print is concerned, but we have also now a digital edition, and that's much more important for us. This is a kind of news platform.
And that's really the main thrust of what you're doing today.
Exactly.
It's really that online portal approach.
Exactly.
It's an awesome project. I'm a fan. But
you.
let us. Why don't you tell us a bit more about your vision and idea of Nebelspalter?
I want to build a news platform which is liberal, which is different from the mainstream you were talking about, because that's also my impression that the media turned just very, very left wing, and almost all of them. That's the problem, and it's not only the problem in Switzerland; it's also a problem
everywhere.
in the US. It's a problem
In
in
the
Europe.
West.
It's actually a fact for almost every Western country, and I think this is really dangerous. Because it's not good. I think I really believe in the competition of ideas. I really think it's extremely important for a democracy that we have different perspectives.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm absolutely convinced the left, they are wrong about many, many things, about all of the things, maybe. But still, I think it's okay. They are useful, because I need also somebody
Absolutely.
I can discuss with. But on the other hand, if it's so distorted, if there's only one voice, and this is a left-wing voice, we have a problem. And the Nebelspalt tries to become this different voice in Switzerland, a liberal voice, but also a very accurate voice. I think if you ask me about, you know, what are your most important key principles in journalism, I really think first it has to be news. I mean, a news doesn't mean it has to happen now. It has to be something which is relevant, which is interesting, which you read and then you think, hey, I didn't know that. Interesting. I want to tell my wife about that. I think that's important. It has to be news. That's the first thing. The other thing is actually it has to be precise, accurate. I mean, I prefer facts. I really think this is also one of the reasons why the West actually was successful, because we are quite empirical. I mean, everybody is much more empirical than many, many people in other places in the world. So I think this is a success story.
At least that's part of our DNA.
Yeah.
We need to get
It
back
used
to
to be
that.
the part of our DNA, and now it's also in danger actually. But still, I think for a good platform, it's extremely important that you are accurate, that people think you are reliable, you don't exaggerate, you don't lie, you don't distort the facts.
I mean, what I like about the Nebelspalter, though, in addition to what you say, I think it's also entertaining.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You know, so I mean, I listen, and my wife too. My wife and I, we often together, sometimes on the weekends, we listen to all 5 episodes of the week of the Bern Einfach.
Oh, that's nice.
And That is entertaining too. You guys are funny.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
it's,
I think that's also a little bit the goal. I mean, we
yeah.
have to be funny.
Especially us on the more conservative or liberal side, it's important that we tell the story
Hmm.
in a less boring way.
Hmm.
Because the way we tend to be is very dry and fact and statistics oriented, right? And you
Exactly.
kind of need both. So really like the way you guys are doing that.
I also think this is a problem with the conservatives. You are absolutely right that the conservatives, they are too serious often,
Hmm.
above all in Switzerland, of
Yeah.
course. And it's an interesting fact that, for example, maybe you know William Buckley. That was a
Yeah.
very important conservative in the US in the 1950s. And one reason why he was so successful was actually the fact that he was a very nice person, he was a gentleman, and he was funny.
Yeah.
He was funny. And at that time, people thought, hey, everybody who is conservative must be serious and boring
Yeah.
and ugly.
Yeah.
And he was such a light-hearted person that
Another guy
people
that
just
had a
fell in
great
love.
humor was Ronald Reagan,
Oh,
right?
very
I mean,
important.
he was so charming, and
Yeah.
he had humor, which was awesome.
People have to feel that you are serious, but on the other hand, you are not so damn sure that you are right. I think
Right.
this is so stupid if people think, hey, I know everything. I am like God. And I think
Yeah.
this is one reason why
Yeah, it
people
makes you
think,
more approachable and human. So going back to the Nebelspalter, one of the things that I thought you did really well and I was really intrigued by was the fact that you actually brought together, I guess, like 60 or 70 investors,
hmm,
which most of them, I think, from what you said, were entrepreneurs.
hmm,
So you basically were able to finance the project with a contribution from that entrepreneurial heart of Switzerland,
hmm,
which I thought was excellent also to start the project that way. Does that help you today still? Do you get support from those entrepreneurs?
absolutely.
Because yeah,
I think that was a wonderful experience actually,
yeah,
also for me personally,
yeah,
because I had to do the fundraising, and in the beginning I didn't know that there are so many people who really care about journalism in Switzerland,
yeah,
who really were prepared to support this
yeah.
kind of project. And as everybody knows, media is not really the best investment
I don't think
today.
they went in for the investment.
No, not really. No, no, but you also have to believe in this
Absolutely.
project, and that was just a great experience,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
this kind of trust, because I mean they had to invest like 100,000 francs, which
Was
is
that pretty much everyone put
everybody
100,000?
everybody
Yeah,
had to invest just 100,000 francs, but
yeah,
not more and not less,
yeah.
and I mean, this is a lot of money and this is a lot of trust.
Mm,
And this is also a lot of responsibility for me
yeah,
to make it happen. I mean, this project has to be a success, of course, but I also think it shows actually, how how many people are still around who really care about this country, about the
absolutely.
future of this country. And I also think it was no coincidence that most of them, as you said, were entrepreneurs.
Yeah,
They know how important entrepreneurs were in the history of Switzerland
yeah.
and how important they still are going to be in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if we go, you've written several books, and one of the books we'll talk about in German is Warum die Schweiz reich geworden ist, why Switzerland became so rich. In the essence, it comes out of this book, you realize Switzerland is a country of entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
It's to this day, if you look at the statistics, we just recently were again ranked at the top of the world in
Hmm.
terms of the WIPO Innovation Index.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that tradition up until now has been carried forward. And so building Nebelspalter that way, I
Hmm.
think is awesome because we need to reactivate to some
Hmm.
degree
Hmm.
the entrepreneurs and get them involved in the way our country is led and built and brought into the future.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I also think one reason why I'm a little bit concerned about the situation now in Switzerland is actually the fact that so many people have no idea anymore why this country is so successful. And even entrepreneurs, they don't know those facts so much because in our schools, nobody learns about the
Yeah,
history of Switzerland
yeah.
anymore. And if you learn something about Switzerland, you just learn, oh, many, many problems
Yeah, yeah,
in
it's
the
generally more of
past
a
and
negative spin.
very
Yeah, I
negative.
agree.
And it's also something which is not special about Switzerland. I mean, I think even in the US, I mean, when we were in the US, our kids went to school and they learned about the Second World War. What did they learn about the problem of Japanese internees camps in California? That was one problem they learned about,
Yeah.
and the other was actually that African Americans they couldn't get they couldn't become fighter pilots. Of course, that's a problem. That's not nice. No problem. I'm not kidding about that. But they didn't learn, for example, the small fact that America was quite important for winning the Second World War. They didn't learn that. So
Yeah.
it's I think it's a very bad fashion
I mean,
in the
one of the things
West.
that I think is really important, and actually reading your books, you wrote this book. I also read General Guison, which is an awesome. You should translate that one as well. Marignano, I started. What's really cool about reading books like yours is the fact that you realize that I think generally people think, the past is always 2020 vision. That's not true. It's not true at all. History actually can be written and seen and interpreted in many ways. And so what you do is really you give a different perspective, and one that you package in these stories of people. And there, when we go into the book a bit and why Switzerland became rich, it's really cool to see how, for example, the entrepreneurship in Switzerland was built, how religion played a role, and how over many centuries something formed that has become extremely successful today. And it's a unique story that you need to portray and show its positive sides.
I mean, I think this is also very typical for Switzerland and for the Swiss, and we are both being Swiss. So we don't talk about our success so much. So that's the reason why people don't know
It's a
that
beautiful thing. Something
Switzerland
I
is so
love about the
successful.
Swiss is that we are a bit understatement.
Absolutely.
So it makes, to one degree, when you work with Swiss, when you're dealing with the Swiss, it creates a level of, if someone tells you, I can do this, you kind of know he can do it. There's other countries that are a bit more on the overstatement side. If they say they can do something, you better second guess and check first. But
Exactly.
I agree.
And I also think it has to do with our history, because actually I think you were talking about Marignano, about my book. I think the interesting thing about this battle or about the book is Switzerland is probably the oldest existing small state in the world. And if you are a small state surrounded by big powers, it's a smart idea always to be in the understatement.
So Marignano, we have to explain a bit. Marignano was a battle in 1515, and back then the Swiss were the force to count on. Everyone wanted Swiss mercenaries because they knew then they could win the battle. But you'll have to explain that a bit, because back then there was a fear that the Swiss would become too big. But we decided to go not to overstatement, but to understatement.
Exactly. I mean, it's a little bit more, how can I say, complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one reason why Switzerland exists has to do with the fact that the Swiss mountaineers, they were just very, very tough soldiers. And they were so tough that everybody in Europe wanted to hire them. And that was actually the first industry of Switzerland, which was extremely successful, which was actually exporting young men who were brutal, who were tough, who were the best fighters of the world at that time. So everybody wanted to hire them. And one reason why Switzerland was so successful at warfare had to do with the fact that, in the Middle Ages you had the knights, you had this huge fighting machine. Actually, it was kind of a tank of the Middle Ages. It was the knight with his horse and then with his armor and so on.
But the Swiss were not armored.
Exactly, and that's the reason why the Swiss became so famous, because it was a military revolution going on here in the mountains, that the Swiss were able to fight against an army of knights, and they were successful. The first battle was Morgarten, that was 1315, and at that time that was a world event. Because
what was the difference? What did they do differently?
They were extremely good at as an infantry. They were extremely good because they were well organized. They were extremely high motivated. Those were farmers, so they fought for their country, which was important because the knights, they always had, they had infantry, but the infantries, they were slaves or just poor people and so on. They didn't treated them well. And the Swiss infantry, this was an army of citizens.
So
And
that was in Morgarten. That's where it started because they fought for their own country. And then they
for the
started to act as mercenaries later with those tactics.
Exactly, and the tactics were actually, they were fast, well organized, extremely brutal, very brutal. I mean, they didn't make any prisoners, they didn't take any prisoners. There was even a law in Switzerland that you had to kill everybody on
Really?
the battlefield, everybody. Even
I
when
didn't know that.
the victory was safe, you had to kill everybody.
Boy, what happened to the Swiss?
Yeah, we're
It
still
changed a
that.
lot,
We're
yeah.
still that way. Watch out. No, but it's interesting. I
Right?
mean, we were really the Taliban. The
Mm,
Taliban of the Middle Ages. This
yeah,
is not an overstatement. And that
interesting.
was the reason why people were also extremely afraid of the Swiss, because they knew, hey, if you deal with the Swiss, you're going to be killed afterwards, even if you
Mhm.
surrender.
No
There's no
mercy.
point
No
in
mercy.
surrendering. Just run away. And it's an amazing story, and it's also from a military historical standpoint, it's
Yeah.
really an important turning point. It's the similar turning point you can also observe in England. In England, you had the long bow. That was
Yeah.
a new weapon, which was also a weapon of the farmers,
Yeah.
of the yeomen, and
Yeah.
they were also very successful in the battles against the knights. And because knight and farmer, this is also a social difference, of
Mm,
course.
mhm.
And that's one reason why Switzerland became such a political special case. In German, politischer Sonderfall.
Yeah.
It's a special case. Switzerland is really a special case because from the 14th century on, Switzerland is actually a republic. Of course, they had still the emperor, the German emperor, and so on. But the German emperor, first of all, he was far away. And second, most of them were Habsburgs, and the Swiss, they were always successful when they had to fight the Habsburgs.
Mhm.
And this is important also for the economic history of Switzerland, because this kind of republican DNA is still important
Deeply,
today. I
deeply
mean,
ingrained.
as you know, we Swiss, we don't have, how can I say, a standard language. We have a dialect.
Yeah.
Everybody speaks his own dialect.
And
Here
not
with
just dialects, 4 languages, which is
Absolutely,
unique, right? I mean, for a small
absolutely.
country, and we were able to still, over history, integrate all of that into a peaceful nation,
Absolutely.
which is unique.
This is one reason why it's so amazing. But the other thing is actually, say Britain, you have Oxford English.
Mhm.
In France, you have the French of Paris. In Germany, you have the High German.
Yeah.
And in Switzerland, you don't have this kind of special language for, the upper classes.
Yeah.
And this is also a republican attitude. Everybody is more or less the same. I mean, of course, in Switzerland, you have also differences, social differences. Of course, we have also rich and poor. We always had. But still, it was always more egalitarian than in other countries. And
Yeah.
this has to do with this republican tradition. I mean, one reason why the Swiss at that time didn't take prisoners, that's also an interesting story. In the Middle Ages, it was absolutely normal that, in a way, you fought the battle and then somebody surrendered, and then you just took him as a prisoner, and then you could talk to his relatives or his city or his bishop and so on, and then he could pay a ransom for this prisoner. And then you made really a lot of money. And it depended on the fact if you had, a nobleman as a prisoner or just a poor farmer. For a poor farmer, you didn't get a huge ransom. So actually you could kill him because you couldn't make money
No
with him.
money.
But if you had a nobleman, you really treated him very well, and then you could actually, you could sell him, because the Swiss were so egalitarian and they really hated the nobility.
Yeah.
So they thought, hey, we don't play this game We just kill everybody.
Yeah.
We don't care. And people just didn't understand that. But it was very a revolutionary thing in a way. So this tradition is important in Switzerland.
Yeah, I think also that, I mean, what you're just saying really triggers the fact that I think today still there is in Switzerland, deep in our DNA, there's that skepticism versus the elite, right? I think that is more present than maybe in other countries. So, and we have to watch out that we don't lose that, because everywhere you see a tendency that with wealth, with progress, more and more power, more and more finances, more and more debt is with the government. And so you have, you know, what we say, a crowding out of the private sector. So that entrepreneurial spirit and that skepticism of the Habsburg elite, you know, of someone who tells you how to live your life is deeply ingrained in our DNA. So we started our first, what you said, our first industry, successful industry, was being mercenaries. We then became more civilized and started other industries. I think the next really big success story was, I guess, around the 1700s, which had to do with the textile industry. And there, in your book, what I hadn't been aware of before was the interplay or the interaction and the importance of, on the one hand, industrializing and these systems of creating textile products, you know, with, in German, Verlagswesen. But on the other hand, also religion. The fact that, you know, in the Ticino particularly, you had this fight between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the Catholics basically killing or driving away the Protestants, and they then came north, which then created this interesting mix of, on the one hand, textile production combined with international trade. That was to me was a new, and I thought it was so interesting.
It's interesting, and it's also, in a way, you know, and that's so typical for Swiss history, nobody planned this. There's never a plan in Switzerland. That's also something which is important. I think one reason why this happened is the fact that you had this old confederation, and the old confederation was more or less the same as modern Switzerland. People have to know that. That's also interesting, that our borders are quite old.
They haven't changed that much.
They are very old. And this old confederation was a very decentralized kind of state. I mean, at that time, it's in a way the wrong term. It's not a state in the
It was more of a
modern sense.
brotherhood.
Yeah, but it was a kind of federation of 13 more or less independent cantons, cities or lands, as they said. And the important thing is actually, because it was so decentralized, when the Reformation broke out, you had in Switzerland the interesting development that some cantons turned Protestant and other cantons stayed Catholic. That was actually also the case in other countries in Europe, in France or in Germany or even in England. But in those countries, it was always clear that there was a majority and a minority, and the majority was strong enough to turn away the minority. In France, the Protestants had to leave, the Huguenots. In England, the Catholics had to leave. In Germany, it was split up. I mean, you had many, many different states, and in every state there was a clear religion. And in Switzerland, that was not the case. And that was the reason why we were very attractive for many, many Protestant refugees from all over Europe. And it started with the Ticino. And Ticino at that time was, I mean, it was already part of Switzerland, but actually it was Italy still. I mean, it was since the Roman time, it was always part of the Duchy of Milan. So Milan, so it was actually Italy. And there you had this kind, as you said, this very, very important stronghold of Protestants in Locarno, a city in the Ticino. And of course, the Catholics were in the majority, and then because they were in the majority, they were able to drive them out. And first of all, most Protestant cities in Switzerland, they were not prepared to take them on. But Zurich was the big exception, and then so like 140 Protestant families from the Ticino came to Zurich. And the interesting thing is, at that time, Zurich was always a city governed by the guilds. Guilds were
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah.
And as you know, I mean, this is a kind of an early cartel. They didn't want outsiders working in the same fields as they
Yeah.
did. So the people from Ticino, they had a problem. How can I make a living? Because I was not allowed to be, you know, I couldn't be like a carpenter or a fisherman or and so on. It was
So
forbidden.
the guilds would not allow them to be a member of the guild because they were not Zurich
Yeah, and
ancestry.
they couldn't work on their job.
Oh, they were not
Yeah,
allowed, so they were
if you
forbidden.
were,
Yeah.
for example, a shoemaker in Locarno, and then you came to Zurich,
You were forbidden to do
you
shoes.
couldn't forget about your shoemaking skills. You could be the best. This is typical for the Middle Ages. It was not capitalism at that time, so it was regulated. It was strongly regulated, strictly regulated. So they had to make a living. What did they do? And as you said, they knew something very important. They knew how to speak Italian, which was an advantage because at that time Italy was the most important and the richest country in Europe because it was our hub. I mean, you know, everything which was important or interesting at that time came from the East, from India, China, and the Middle East. And Italy was the hub, the European hub for this kind of trade. And so it was an extremely important and interesting market. And the people from Ticino living in Zurich now, they knew the market in Italy. So, of course, they organized the new trade between
So international trade very much was
international trade.
invented by them for Switzerland.
Exactly, exactly, in Zurich and also in Basel.
That's how the textile industry in Switzerland
Because
became so
because
successful.
first they just did trade
They
and
scaled it up
then
internationally.
realized, hey, why should we just buy stuff in Italy and sell it in the north? We could also produce this stuff in Zurich, for example.
Right.
At that time, silk was very interesting, so they even tried to produce silk in Zurich, which didn't work out so well. But still, I mean, they could produce silk textiles, so they were very successful in that, and they were always also introducing the cotton industry in Zurich. And as you said, this very special, already capitalist system of organizing the workload, this Verlagssystem.
You have
This
to
kind of
explain that a bit, Markus.
That's interesting
Because
because
it's unique, I
yeah,
think.
I mean, it's not unique for Switzerland. It's actually very common in Italy. It was very common, and
They
it's
did that as well.
yeah, because Florence, for example, was the center of the textile industry at that time in the 13th century.
But we have to explain what it is because it's not a factory approach. It's an
No,
approach where the entrepreneur basically creates what you would today call a network company.
exactly. I
So
mean,
decentralized organization, mostly farmers. Very often it would be the farmer's wife in the evening would be producing and working on the textile product.
and the important thing is that the entrepreneur, he's actually the man who really organizes everything. He buys the raw materials, and you have to know this market. Then he's importing the raw materials to his city. There he knows who is able to make the textiles, and then he's also exporting the textiles. You didn't make those textiles for your local market. No, you had to export them, and that was also the reason why the entrepreneur became also so important, because he had to know the foreign markets,
Yeah.
which is not. I mean, this was difficult in the Middle Ages. You didn't have this kind of transport possibilities as we
You had to go over
have.
the
The
passes of
communication
Switzerland.
was much slower, of
Yeah.
course, but still, I mean, people who think or talk about globalization today, and most people have the impression, oh, that's something very recent, and you know, for 30 years we know this fact now. This is totally wrong. Globalization is a phenomenon which is much older. You can see that already in the Middle Ages, also the East-West trade from China to Europe and so on. But of course, only a minority of people were involved at that time. The new system was totally different. It was modern. It was capitalist. You had actually in the center, because that's the reason actually I think capitalism is a good term for this kind of market economy we know nowadays, because the capital was important. The entrepreneur, he was actually, he owned the capital right from the beginning when he bought the raw material, then he put out the work to some farmers, and then he exported the product. And he was always the owner of the produce. That's very important.
When you say that, I agree. I think the capital in terms of the money, the one who puts up the risk in terms of capital, that's part of capitalism. But even when I read your book, I mean, the other part of capitalism is the fact that you're building on top of the capital and the history, the knowledge, the machines, the systems that those before you built. That's a big part of capitalism, is the fact that it doesn't stop. It's something which we all, basically everything we do today is built on the capital that was invested, the risk that was taken before us. And so that's the other part of capitalism. That's not just money, it's all those other factors which have made Switzerland successful in the end.
Absolutely. And to be sure, I mean, at that time, capital was not huge in a way. It was not important to have a lot of capital. So, because actually most of them, it was, those textiles were handmade in a way. They didn't have machines. They didn't have factories. So the capital stock was actually quite small at that time. So people, I think that was also a reason why people in the 50s had this totally wrong idea that you could develop those poor countries in Africa or Asia and so on. You just had to invest a lot of money, and then everything would develop by itself, and that's totally wrong. And I think the history of Switzerland shows what is important. Important is the fact that you have to have entrepreneurial talent. And this is not something which is so easy to find. You have to develop that. That's the reason why those Protestant refugees were so important. I like to think, for example, today you have the Silicon Valley. And if you have people who are so highly qualified, who are skilled, who are talented, and you just drive them away. I mean, we know that from history. We know that about the Jews in Germany. We know that about the Huguenots in France. It's a stupid idea, first of all. But the country that is actually
receiving
the goal of those refugees, it really profits from this fact. And I think Switzerland is a very good example of this truth in a way, because actually without Protestantism, I'm absolutely sure Switzerland would have turned maybe also quite rich, but not that successful as it was from a very early stage on. And I think this is also something which people have to know. Many people think, hey, Switzerland, banking secrecy, no war, maybe even slavery or something like that. The Swiss. We know the Swiss. They are smart, but not very sincere, and so on. That's the reason why they became rich. And most people don't realize, first, Switzerland has become rich quite some time ago. And second...
on the basis of a very bad start. Because compared to other countries, it's a country of mountains, rocks, and dirt, right? I mean, we don't really have the resources that some other countries had. So
absolutely.
So the story is quite phenomenal, and entrepreneurship is something that to this day I think makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. And it's also interesting to think about the reason why. I mean, first of all, we were talking about the Reformation. We were talking about the Protestant refugees. That's one thing which was important. But on the other hand, you have also to make sure that people who are talented can actually be successful in your country. So you have to have a kind of political environment which is very good for entrepreneurship. And that's also something which is a secret of the Swiss success, that actually the environment in Switzerland, the political environment, was always very, very convenient for people who wanted to establish a company, who wanted to be innovative, or who wanted to become rich. And this is something which is quite surprising, because Switzerland is actually, I said it was established in the High Middle Ages in a way. This country, so many features of this country are still medieval. You know, even the political system is very old. I mean, this kind of federalism we know has nothing to do with some smart guys drawing up a plan. No, it's not true. It's a historical fact. It's just it has developed without a big plan.
So
So
I think, people have to read the book. It's because ultimately there's an element of organic growth and a long history, which resulted in something that works really well. Well, what's interesting is that our Constitution from 1848, when we actually became more of a nation state, is very similar to the U.S. Constitution, in a sense of its structure. However, Switzerland has some, if we look at some of the unique things about the system that exists today in Switzerland, one you mentioned already is the direct democracy, where people on a regular basis, I mean, we vote like 4 times a year on specific issues. We don't just elect our representatives into parliament. That is part of the process as well. Initiatives and referendums are used quite frequently. We have a system where neutrality evolved, and that's something that also had to do with Marignano actually originally. So there's several factors. Maybe neutrality is one we can touch on briefly, because that's one that's being challenged and questioned and it's discussed a lot right now.
actually, if you look at the Swiss history, it turns out that it was always quite difficult. Because actually the concept of neutrality, first of all, had to do with the fact that Switzerland was decentralized, and it was also absolutely split into Catholics and Protestants. And because in the 16th century, when the Reformation took place, after the Reformation, for 100 years, every war in Europe had to do with the fact that there were 2 denominations. It was always Catholics against Protestants and vice versa. So for Switzerland, that was really a problem, because actually you couldn't be a party in a war, because if you were on the side of the Catholics, you had your own Protestants in your country who were against you. So in a way, it was always a question of survival.
So it was not just external neutrality, it actually was internal peace too.
First of all, it was internal. You had to be neutral, otherwise the survival of the country would have been at risk. So that's the reason why for the first 100 years, Switzerland was not able to take part in any war, just because of that. And during the 30 Years' War, that was interesting, and I was talking about this moral issue, and already at that time, you could see that it was a moral problem to be neutral. Because, I mean, the Protestants of Europe, they came to Zurich, and they were saying, hey, you are Protestant, and you are not on our
Helping
side.
us.
Why are you not in the war against the Catholic Emperor? The Catholic Emperor, the Habsburgs, they are massacring the Protestants in Germany, and you just stand by and think we are neutral. So it was at that time, it was also very, very hard to be neutral.
So this is not new,
No,
basically,
it's not new. We
this
know
discussion.
that very well. I mean, the same is true during the Second World War. It was hard to be neutral when the Third Reich was butchering everybody else. I mean, that was also hard. And I wouldn't say that to be neutral is something which is morally superior. Absolutely not. But for the survival of a small state in Europe, where you always had big powers fighting each other, it was a good idea to be neutral. But as I said, it's important. First of all, it was an internal problem.
I mean, we use in Switzerland, we have that expression, integral neutrality. Can you explain that a bit?
Actually, I think it's an interesting term because, after the First World War, you had the League of Nations. It was established, and at that time already people thought, hey, now we have the League of Nations. War is something of the past. We have solved the problem. And at
the end
that
of
time,
history, just like when the wall fell.
Exactly. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, if you think about it, it's amazing because everybody actually who was a little bit attentive would know that this kind of peace after the First World War is not going to last.
Mm.
So it was at that time already quite naive, but still, Switzerland was member of the League of Nations. There was a referendum in Switzerland. It was very close, actually. It was very close. It was very controversial. Not many people wanted to join the League of Nations. And then Switzerland had to adapt its neutrality at that time. And then they said, okay, we are neutral when there is war. But if the League of Nations is, for example, considering any economic sanctions, we will be part of that. So that was the problem. And that then the term in German is a differentiated neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
They differentiate. I can't pronounce it. Differenzielle
Yeah, yeah,
Neutralität,
yeah,
and that meant actually, in a way, it's like a little bit like today.
yeah.
That of course, if there is war, we are not taking part, but if there is an economic sanction, we have to.
Yeah.
And then when Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, invaded Ethiopia in the 30s, Switzerland was also supposed to sanction Italy, which was hard for Switzerland because Italy was a very important trading partner, and still also it was unusual for the Swiss to do that. And then they actually, when the war was over, they made sure that this is not going to happen again, and that's the term.
That was the beginning of integral.
Integral neutrality means
Yeah.
actually traditional neutrality.
Okay.
But on the other hand, one has to be honest. I mean, neutrality was always difficult as a concept because I think this is also interesting for the Swiss history. I mean, Switzerland being a very small country, you always had to make sure that there was a big power around that favored you a little bit. We needed a protector
Mm-hmm.
because actually, I mean, it's not normal that the country in the middle of Europe with many strategically extremely important passes through the Alps, and also a country where some people are quite successful, which was not really poor, and people who knew Switzerland in the 18th century, they really knew that. They knew that. So it was interesting actually to invade Switzerland. And so we needed somebody who is actually on our side. So first it was France, then it was Great Britain, and I think since the Second World War it was America.
Mm-hmm.
And it still is.
Mm-hmm.
So that also means that neutrality always means you have to be pragmatic. From time to time, you have to make concessions, I think.
I mean, our position now, I mean, in the world is difficult in a sense that we want to maintain our political system, which is a federalistic direct democracy system. We have the EU around us, which actually would like to make us part of them and kind of just take us in via osmosis. I guess, I mean, osmosis, I'm not sure that's English, but so the protectorship of the US, do you think that is really still there? Is that link still there? Because the US has its own problems these days, and to some degree, Switzerland is quite alone as that little country in the midst of the EU at this point.
Yes, that's also my impression, because actually, of course, we have still NATO, which means that's American military protection,
Yeah.
and I think this is still very important, but it's important for everybody in Europe, so this is no difference. And the EU is actually, people thought that the EU might be the new partner, but obviously, as it turned out, we are not part of the European Union because actually we are a direct democracy and there will never be a majority in the population that really favors joining the European Union. I'm absolutely sure about that.
Me
So
too.
this partner,
Less and less. I mean,
absolutely,
anyone with a brain that watches what's going on in the EU has to
exactly.
say it's better to stay out unless the EU reinvents itself,
Yeah, but
which will not happen. It's
no, I think it's impossible.
it's
It's
become
impossible.
much too centralistic and bureaucratic, and democracy is not being lived by the EU, in my view. I think the German voter, if you asked him, he doesn't know what's going on in Brussels, and so I don't think that in Switzerland ever there will be a majority, even though we still have there are some Swiss politicians that would love to be part of the EU. Why is that? I mean, what is their thinking?
I think for politicians, it's quite an interesting concept still. I mean, if you look at Brussels, if you look at the European Parliament, I was just doing a piece about the fact that the members of parliament in the European Union, I mean, they make a lot of money. They make more money than somebody who is a member of the Congress in the US. I mean, it's ridiculous because actually they are not very powerful. And I think, but I still think that many politicians, and I think this is true for most of the politicians nowadays in the West, they don't like democracy so much. It's really a nuisance. I mean, all those elections all the time, it's expensive, it's risky for them. They can lose an election. They don't like that so much. You always have the impression anyway that you know better because people are too dumb to realize that climate change is a huge problem, racism is a huge problem, and the regular voter doesn't see it that way, but this is just a nuisance. I think that's the reason why it's so attractive. It's kind of undemocratic, I think. This is the reason in
That
union
brings us back to
anymore.
that topic we started off on or mentioned earlier, the fact that, we're skeptical about the elites, and the elites are not really interested in democracy because they actually would be able to much more quickly and efficiently run the whole show and every piece of our life. And that's not true.
It's a dilemma. I think everybody who is talented and smart tends to think he knows better.
Yeah.
And in a way, yeah, I can understand that. And I mean, we also belong probably to this group that we think from time to time, yeah, we know better. And if
Yeah,
you
we
know
do. But I
better,
think also at the same time, based on where we stand, I think we respect the fact that as a whole, as a collective, the voter has a lot of brains and intellect and has his tradition and values. And if you look at Switzerland, we were built, or one of the unique elements of the Swiss DNA again is that we were a militia system. So basically, when we were 20, we went to the military and we still had an army of like 600,000 standing men. We've shrunk it since then because there's no more,
one of the biggest armies in
one of the
Europe.
biggest armies in Europe. But what that did was, that militia approach created a situation where everyone, the doctor's son, the politician's son, the farmer's son, everyone was in, that situation together, and you learn to respect each other. That militia system went across all dimensions, and also in politics. We had a lot more people that were not full-time politicians, and now you have all these professional politicians, many of them young people that have never really worked, and certainly have never paid the salary of another person, but they think they know how to run the country and how to build a business. And that's one of the issues I think we have to deal with, where we have to reactivate that inclusion or activity of the entrepreneurs. But it's not easy because the lawmaking, the state has grown so much that I think most of those guys up there in Bern, they don't really read everything anymore. I don't think they have the time
Yeah, and I
to
think
read
it's
all
also,
the laws.
yeah, I think it's also impossible. I mean, I know a lot of people who are member of parliament,
Mhm.
and what they are telling me, I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, if they have a session of a committee beforehand, they get like stuff like this,
Yeah,
and they are
yeah,
supposed to study this stuff,
yeah.
and this is just ridiculous. They can't do that.
Unless they really spend that time, and
Yeah,
so
or
it's
they have to hire somebody
yeah,
who is doing it for
yeah,
them. And the same is true in the US, the same is true in
right,
Brussels.
right.
And I think this is really a problem of the West, that we
Mhm.
have a kind of state that is really expanding
It's
fast in
growing
a
and growing.
way which is so hard to control.
Yeah,
And it's not only a problem that I'm a liberal and I think, government is not the solution to every problem. Mostly it's the problem, actually. So,
I agree.
no, it's also because I think there are too many people who actually don't have to do anything and they are making up some problems to look for solutions to problems nobody knew that they existed
Yeah,
before. And
yeah.
so I think this is really kind of a perpetuum mobile.
I guess for me, the question we have to deal with today, and as Swiss, as Americans, is whether we can find our way back to that type of democracy that our
Mhm.
Constitution was
Mhm.
built on, which is one that requires discourse. And where I see the problem, I'm not against government, as I don't think you are either,
Mhm.
as long as government means it's serving the people. I mean,
Mhm.
that's our model is built on
Mhm.
the basis of the sovereign individual, and the government then providing service to that individual. And we created a structure where the powers should balanced, right? It should be balanced. And at this point, that's just kind of being lost a bit because the media has become very, single-minded, I would say.
Mhm.
We're losing it a bit because the politicians are becoming more and more professional politicians, full-time politicians,
Mhm.
which really creates a situation where they're overwhelming us with the laws and regulations.
Mhm.
They're growing bigger and bigger.
Mhm.
They're having more and more influence on every part of our life.
Mhm.
And they have the finances and the power of the money.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the big changes was Bretton Woods when we went away from the gold standard, which basically created this weapon of mass destruction, where central banks and governments can basically solve any problem, supposedly, with money. And
Absolutely.
that is something which I wonder, where's the end game of that?
Absolutely. And I think also if you think about Switzerland now, about the policy of the Swiss National Bank, I mean, I'm very critical about that because I think, I think the franc should be freely floating, actually. And I don't see the point in trying all the time to have this kind of more or less fixed exchange rate with the euro. And I also think this kind of intervention, and that's also my problem, it's not very democratic. We have three
Yeah.
people. We have three people deciding our monetary policy. And I mean, this is crazy.
I have to tell you,
Yeah.
I like our, at least, the bank, the Swiss National Bank that we have today. Also, Thomas Jordan, I think, is doing an excellent job because it is the fact that we're not the ones ruling. It's the US that pretty
Mm-hmm,
much
mm-hmm,
gives the tact. And we somehow have to manage that because I think if the franc was free floating,
mm-hmm.
it would probably be way too strong. On
Yeah,
the
of
other hand,
course.
I agree the intervention is a problem, but at least in the case of our Swiss National Bank, I don't think that they are a fan of that intervention. It's not like they're seeking that. They're trying to do
No,
the best
that's
possible
true.
they can.
Yeah,
Whereas in other cases, there is a bit of a power grab.
absolutely. I think it's also very typically Swiss. They do it, but with a bad conscience.
With humility.
Yeah, with humility,
Yeah.
but with a bad conscience. And I'm not so sure if I don't agree actually. I think the franc should freely free float, but I mean you are the expert, you know much more than me. But I just don't like the idea that our Swiss National Bank is always trying to do something which is only the case because of the Fed and the European Central Bank.
Right.
And the consequences, the political consequences, are now so enormous.
I don't disagree with you. I think the ideal world would be a free floating Swiss
Mm,
franc. And history has shown that a free floating currency that is a strong currency, even though, the reflex is to say that, oh, it makes exports
mm,
difficult.
mm,
The fact is that strong currency countries like Germany
mm,
have always been more innovative I mean, Germany is the best example, has been the
mm,
export champion of the
mm,
world.
mm,
And so a strong currency does not automatically kill your economy. I'm 100% with you
mm,
there. It's a bit of a balancing act.
mm,
If you watch what has been happening with international currencies under the lead of the US, then the euro came along, it's basically been a step-by-step monetary inflation.
mm,
And to some degree, I feel like Switzerland kind of had to keep up with that
mm,
to be able to, stem the economic growth, to be
mm,
able to have, the yeah, basically the growth of the economy, the GDP growth under control. Um, it would be nice if everyone would play according to the rules. So if we had
absolutely.
less manipulation
Yeah,
of
and I
currency.
think it's also a dilemma in a way because I can see the point that you have to have a central bank and the central bank has to be independent. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, we are also a democracy. And if monetary policy, and it always was extremely important, of course, I mean, also in the 30s, it was extremely important. You had a Great Depression because of the wrong monetary policies in the US, of course. That's the argument of Milton Friedman, and I think he's right. So it has
I agree.
political implications, and those are from time to time huge.
I agree.
And in a way, it's not right.
And
that
we're
in
seeing,
a
I mean,
democracy,
we're at the end game of that, right? We're
Yeah.
seeing the results of really 40 years of, or 50 years at this point, of monetary expansion. And over those years, interest rates came down lower and lower. Inflation actually came down low. Now we're at that turning point, and that there is an aftermath of that. I agree 100%.
And you were also talking about the fact that Germany, when it was a hard currency country, I mean, it's not the case anymore. But at that time, it was really successful, and that's true also for Switzerland, of course. I mean, Switzerland always had a very strong currency, and it's also a little bit our DNA that our success has to do with the fact that we were always in a very difficult situation, not only as far as the currency is concerned, but for example, if you're a very small country, you don't have a big market. So you always had to export. That's one reason why Switzerland was so early. A country which just exported the hell out of it. And that has to do with the fact our market is so small. And that means that you always had to adapt to politicians or policies in other countries, and you were without any leverage. You had no chance to change the politics in France. No chance. You just had to adapt. And it turns out that was an advantage. That the Swiss, they really had to learn to be flexible. They really had to learn to be innovative. They really had to be always cheaper or more sophisticated. You can choose. And I mean, in fact, at the beginning of our industrial success story, for example, wages are very low, were very low in Switzerland. So it was actually a cheap labor country in the beginning. Now it's not the case anymore. But I just wanted to say that in a way it's tough, but on the other hand, it's a very it's a constellation that always forces you to be different. And I think that's also one reason why this country is so
I mean, if you look
successful.
at the numbers now, one of the big numbers that I think is really important is, for example, debt to GDP ratio. You know, even though we spent a lot of money on Corona and we have had the monetary inflation to some degree, our debt to GDP ratio, especially the net one, is still very low. I think it's somewhere around 20% at this point, or even lower, which is unique internationally. Most people, you know, most countries, including the US, are above 100%. And there again, it's not the people or it's that direct democracy system, right? With the Schuldenbremse, what is that? The debt brake, or the brake of the debt, you know, which we put in. And the last few years, we've kind of broken that rule a bit, but we're trying to get back to that. So despite Corona, despite, you know, the overall economic situation, Switzerland, when it comes to all the important numbers, is doing extremely well. And so there's the DNA, the history. There's that existing system that's made up in a very unique way, and all of those factors are still working to some degree. But I think we have to watch out we don't lose them.
Absolutely, and I think the secret of this system is actually, first of all, that it's a historical result. Nobody planned it, and that's also the reason why it works. I mean, if you think about the federalism in Switzerland, I mean, those borders of the cantons, they are crazy. I mean, somebody who's really rational wouldn't come up with this kind of borders.
It's the resilience of chaos.
Absolutely, and still, if you think about the tax competition in Switzerland, it's impossible to introduce that in a country, you know, because nobody wanted to have that, and it's only possible in Switzerland because it's just a historical fact, and I think this is the beauty of our DNA in a way, that this system is only working because it's you know, how can I say, it's also a cultural result in a way. It's not.
I mean, the system that evolved is unique and comes from a culture and history. But if you look at the result in detail, it's interesting. I mean, one of the facts that we've been able to integrate 4 different languages, different religions, and we're a country. I think 30% or so of our people are foreigners, and we have a very peaceful nation. Now the question is, why is our system working, and why, for example, is a system like the system in Sweden
Yeah,
starting to find
yeah.
difficulties,
That's a
right?
very
Because
good question.
it's a social security system
Yeah.
that in Switzerland works very differently than in Sweden. We have one where everyone pays his own way to some degree, and it will depend on how much you pay in, but not everything is paid. I mean, so basically, to be specific, in Sweden, the way it works, I think everyone pays a certain percentage of their salary, no matter how much they make. But in the end, they all get the same level of services. And that's different in Switzerland. And in Sweden, it worked for a long time when everyone was a Swen and a and a
There was no
Börje.
problem. Exactly.
Börje.
Yeah.
At this point, as immigration is growing, they're finding it harder and harder to integrate those people,
Yeah.
or the Swedes find it harder and harder to share
Yeah.
the services with those others that may not bring the same level of discipline or work. They may be unemployed. They may still need training. So they're going to have to adjust that. Our system is quite solid in that chaotic approach, but also that approach that you, to some degree, you also have to look out for yourself, but there are safety nets.
Absolutely. I think Sweden is a very interesting case because in a way it's a small country as well. And I used to think that, if you are a small country, it's already.
It's huge, but
Yeah,
10
but
million. Yeah.
exactly, it's more or less to say, yeah, it's huge, but it's a small country as far as the population is
Yeah.
concerned.
Yeah.
And I always thought that in a way, yeah, if you're a small country, it's easier to handle immigration, everything, because actually, and I still think it's true. If you look at Denmark, if you look at the Netherlands, if you look Belgium is a bad example, or Austria. I think it's an advantage to be small nowadays because actually the ways are shorter, people know each other still, and so on. But I think Switzerland is the most extreme example of a small country because we are not such a small country. We are even decentralized, so everything is so small. I mean, every canton is small, and every village is also very small. And I think this is certainly an advantage if you want to integrate people because if somebody is coming to a small village, people know him. There is some kind of pressure.
There's an accountability.
He has to adapt. He has to learn how the Swiss think, how they live, and he has to adapt. Otherwise, he just can't survive. And I think in Sweden, obviously, it was possible to survive for quite some time without being a Swede. And that's the reason why they have these kind of ghettos now. And I still think that Switzerland doesn't have any ghettos.
We don't have
And it's
ghettos, yeah.
impossible, even in Geneva, which is a mess of a city, but even in Geneva, they don't have this kind of ghettos. But I think you were talking about the fact that we have four languages. I think that's the other reason why we have not the same problems, because as you said, our welfare state, I mean, it's also a generous welfare state nowadays, of course, but still there are big differences. If you are in Zug, you live, you have a different welfare state than in Geneva, obviously. It's a huge difference. And I think this is important because in a way, people got the sense that it depends also a little bit on themselves, how much they get, how much they want to have this kind of welfare state or not. And I think that's also the reason why they feel more responsible.
How much you contribute has an impact on how much you get back. And that's different in Sweden, I think. Markus, we could go on for a long time, but I don't want to stretch your time too much. Maybe we can do this again some other time and maybe look at another book. I think the General book would be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe as a question to come towards the end is, where do you see the biggest challenges now for Switzerland? I think we touched on some of them, but looking forwards, where do you see the biggest challenges and also the biggest opportunities?
That's a good question. First of all, the opportunities. Of course, I think there we are blessed. We are not a member of the European Union. That's a big advantage because the European Union is in such a difficult situation. So in a way, we have to be different, and that's already something. So that's a huge opportunity. If you look from the outside of Europe, Switzerland is the best place to be, to invest,
The
and
benefit
so
of
on.
boundaries in a way, or barriers is huge. And in a way, it creates, again, it fosters more innovation because you have to somehow cope with that. Yeah.
And I also think our system is quite resilient. We could also, as you said, we saw that when the pandemic was a problem. Although we made many mistakes, it's still,
It was
the
less.
bottom
Yeah,
line is
it
positive.
was better.
And challenges, I think one has to do also with the system. I really think Switzerland has normalized in a bad way.
What do you mean?
Normalized, we became more similar to the European environment. Not everything is bad about Europe, of course, and not everything is bad about the European Union. And I love our neighbors, and I really think that's the beauty of Europe, and I still believe in Europe. I think this continent is the most successful continent of world history because of competition, because of I think our Christian heritage. That's another issue for another time. But still, I think Europe has an incredible potential still. But I think many mistakes they are making now in Europe, we also make. And I think this is something which is worrying. And on the other hand, I also think it's even more worrying for us because our system is so special. And if we lose this kind of special system, we lose much more than another country. I think, you were talking about the direct democracy, our federalist system, the militia system, which is unique, which is so important for our success. And those systems.
Also, the vocational training, that's
Exactly.
we have to kind of keep that going as
And
well.
if
It's
you
something.
destroy this system,
Yeah.
first of all, it's
Will never come back.
never comes back. That's the bad thing about history. If you abolish something, it's so hard to reintroduce it again. It's impossible. That's one thing. And this system is so unique that in a way we lose everything. So I think
How can we save it?
we have to talk about that.
We have to talk
No,
about
really,
it.
we
No,
have to talk about that.
I-
We really have to teach our kids
Yeah.
how special this Switzerland is. And that doesn't mean that we are saying, hey, we are the best. The Swiss are not the best. We are humble.
Oh, okay.
That's not
I
our
see what you're
problem.
saying. I was thinking of something else.
We are not
I thought,
arrogant.
I thought you were going to say we have to talk, and have the discourse and basically say, I don't know if I can say that word, political correctness. Maybe
Yeah,
edit
that's
that
also
one
true.
out.
That's
The
also
problem,
true.
I think, what we have to watch out is that we don't go down that road of wokeness and political correctness at all cost, right? Because in the end, our system requires that we're able to discuss, and that goes for any democracy, that we're able to discuss the problems openly and directly and not be afraid of maybe hurting someone's feelings. And
Absolutely.
that's an area which I think in the past Switzerland was able to do that maybe better because we're used to every 4 months voting on specific issues, which means that you and I, we won't always see eye to eye and we'll argue and we'll discuss and it's part of our culture and we can still get along. And we have to maintain that because that's being lost to some degree. In the US, it's become extremely polarized.
And I think it's also typical for a big country. I also think that, for example, if you think about the Netherlands, Netherlands, they still have quite an open discourse. And I think this has to do also with the fact that people know each other. For example, in America, if you didn't agree with somebody, you just moved away because the country is so large. There was always a spot where you could live without the stupid people back home. So I think in Switzerland or in Netherlands or in Austria or in Denmark, you have the advantage that you have to get along because you know this expression in Swiss German. You in Switzerland you meet always twice. It's impossible to get away. But in a way, I think you're absolutely right. I think, democracy is about discourse, it's about talking. But I think that one of our biggest problems is that people have no idea anymore why this system is so different.
Yeah.
And they always think it's arrogant to say we are a special case. And it's not arrogant because it's just a fact. And other countries have other advantages. I mean, who would think of Italy? I mean, Italy is one of the greatest nations of the world. I mean, of course, of course. But if you think about Switzerland, you have to know what is special about this country. And in our case, it's even more important because everything which is our success has to do with this special case. And I think most people are not aware of that.
You have 5 children. So what do you tell them about Switzerland in the future?
They have to listen. They know everything, I mean, in a way, I'm a kind of a teacher without a class. So I like to teach. But no, I think what is really important is this kind of, and I like that also I like that about the Americans. The Americans, they really are very confident. They know what they are worth. And on the other hand, they can be so friendly and so open-minded and so kind. And this is, for me, to be honest, I mean, I studied in Germany and I studied in America. That's the big difference between Germany and the United States. And I think this is really something you have to learn. You have to be self-confident without arrogance. And we are not arrogant. But it's also wrong
We can be proud to
to
some
be
degree.
so humble that you are prepared to give up everything,
Yeah.
which makes you special. I think that would be a disaster.
And I'm really grateful that you're helping getting that message across with the
Hope so.
Nebelspalter.
Hope so.
And thank you
Yes.
so much for this
Thank you.
talk,
Thank you
Markus.
for this
This
very
was great.
interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.